Welcome to the Capital Forum interview series. My name is Joe Tipograph. With me today is Amanda Waite. Amanda Waite is a partner at Hunton & Williams. Prior to joining Hunton, Amanda was a staff attorney in the FTC's Merger 3 shop, where she was awarded the official commendation for meritorious service. Amanda, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
All right, Amanda, let's get right into it. I want to talk about changes we've recently seen in the merger guidelines, where the agencies seem to be saying now that market definition isn't the only way to assess competitive effects. It's just a useful tool. Mm-hmm. What is this trend that we're seeing? This has been the practice prior to the merger guidelines. What have you seen out there?
So, thank you for noticing that it has always been part of the practice. This is something that's not new to the agencies. The agencies have always looked beyond structural factors in analyzing mergers. They always have to tell a story. Telling a story can involve using structural factors, how many competitors are in a market pre and post an acquisition. It also involves looking at the documents of the parties. Anyone who's done a merger in the past 20 years can tell you that the number of documents that you have to submit in a merger investigation is huge and increasing. And so the prominence of those documents in what the FTC and the DOJ ultimately put out in their investigations is not surprising. They're going to look at those documents to give context to the deal, part of telling their story. Now, there's other things that they can look at, too, in telling the story. They look at views of customers. They look at views of competitors, less so than customers. They look at other industry trends. So I think this recognition in the 2010 merger guidelines to looking more holistically at mergers is just an accurate reflection of what the agencies have been doing all along.
Okay. And why do you think that it's only being discussed now?
Well, I think it's being discussed now because the FTC and the DOJ have both taken a very strong role in putting out statements about mergers, both mergers that they challenge and mergers that they clear. And particularly in mergers that they clear, you've seen a trend where statements come out, closing statements from the agencies, explaining why a merger might have a structural, facial case. It might be a 3-2, it might be a 4-3. But there are, for many reasons, the agencies have opted not to challenge that merger. And in those specific cases, those are the exact cases you want to see a closing statement in, because it explains all of these other things that the agencies are looking at to tell their story. And so as the agencies have proceeded to release more of these closing statements, you start seeing more of this emphasis on documents. Now, there's also been a few good cases lately where there have been some interesting documents prominently displayed in the agency complaints, and of course those always get press.
Sure. Now you talk about the agencies in their closing statements explaining why a facially troubling merger might get approved, but what about in the opposite direction? Now that this text is out there, is there a chance that a merger that looks relatively innocuous on its face might end up emerging as something that the agencies find to be more problematic? Mm-hmm.
That's a good question, particularly in light of the change to the guidelines and some of the commentary that's come out around that. But I don't think that the agency's analysis has really changed. Even in cases where there may not have been such a strong structural case for a deal, if the documents are bad and they suggest that there's something else going on in the industries, the agencies have always looked at that.
Okay, we've talked about the role of company documents in recent merger decisions, and how recently we've seen emails from internal employees being prominently displayed in complaints and making it to press. Is this something that we're seeing more of lately?
I think we are seeing a little bit more of it. I think the agencies have been empowered a little bit by the new merger guidelines to prominently display those documents. I think they were always there, but they might be getting a little bit more prominence now because of the new merger guidelines.
And so how are you counseling your clients to anticipate these types of problems?
Not to write the bad documents. I mean, that's a bit of a flip answer, but we've always counseled clients to be very careful about what they write. I mean, clients should assume from the very minute they consider thinking about potentially someday maybe buying another company, that those documents are going to end up on the desk of a regulator, whether it be at the FTC or the DOJ. And this is where antitrust compliance training and pre-merger training can really benefit a company, because you start thinking about stuff very early on. People within the company are not necessarily thinking about antitrust issues at that point. And when you look back at the documents that the agencies have been prominently featuring, they're not necessarily documents where you would have had antitrust counsel kind of watching what's being written at any given point. And sometimes things are often taken significantly out of context. So what a business person says may mean something very different to that business person than to a regulator. The classic example is a salesperson at a company. There's a lot of, I call it macho bravado or macho posturing in the sales industry, and a lot of competition. They're naturally competitive folks, and when salespeople go out, they want to destroy their competition and they want to, beat them down and be dominant in an industry. Well, salespeople saying that means something very different than what an antitrust regulator would think that means. But those types of documents can also, play very prominently in an antitrust complaint or in court. So agencies can use those to buttress their other evidence of a potential violation.
Sure. And in the conduct regime, that's certainly something that seems very palpable that you can counsel a client on. But in the merger context, we're talking about the way that clients, scratch that. In the conduct context, that makes a lot of sense. In the merger context, though, this is the way that these companies discuss their competitors and the way that they discuss their pricing in relationship to their competitors. And you have to imagine that even way before they even first have an inkling of an idea that they're going to be buying somebody, that they are constantly producing these types of documents, discussing their competitors, discussing their pricing strategy. I mean, how could you even begin to address that when you think about these merger compliance programs and counseling your clients here?
Yeah, that's a very tricky issue for sure, and it's an issue that always makes us want to pull our hair out when we have a deal going in front of one of the regulators, because you see the documents that you just know are going to raise a red flag over at the agency. So there's two things that you can do. On the front end, you can try to train as many people who you think would be likely to be creating bad documents, and you can counsel them on how to accurately reflect what they're thinking without using terms that could raise red flags to the agency. That's very hard to do, as you pointed out. On the back end, you can make sure that you understand those documents before they go into a regulator or simultaneously with them going into a regulator. And you can make sure that you know what the full story is behind those documents. And it's often the case in a merger, you spend a lot of time either in depositions, investigational hearings, or just in meetings with agency staff trying to explain away those documents, or give the agency the full picture of what was going on rather than just the small snippet that shows up in that one document that they're looking at.
Have you found that sometimes you can have a sense or be able to anticipate what some of the documents might say, or does it come out as a wild card a lot of the time?
Some of both. Some of both. There have been deals that I've worked on where you've gone into the client, it's a long-standing client relationship, you've done antitrust compliance training with them, you've talked about what kinds of documents to avoid creating, what types of terms not to use, and help the client really more accurately describe what they're trying to say in the document anyway. And then you see their documents a year later or 6 months later, and they say exactly what you asked them not to say. That always is going to happen. But I think it's very important from a counseling perspective to really understand the full business, get involved with the clients and understand what's really going on, because that makes your job a whole lot easier when you have to explain these kind of one-off random comments to a regulator.
And do you find that when you do understand the business, that it sort of gives you that comfort that when you see these documents that you could anticipate them and put them into context?
That's true. That's very true. So, it's very important in my job to keep up with what the companies are doing, to follow their 10Ks, to read their annual reports, to just keep up on their business generally and understand what's going on. It really does help anticipate some of the issues that could come up.
The merger law is Clayton Act Section 7. It talks about substantially lessening competition. But the standard that is used in evaluating mergers is consumer welfare. What is consumer welfare?
Well, that is an interesting question. It is an area that is subject to significant debate right now. There is probably an economic definition of consumer welfare that anyone in Econ 101 would understand, but that's certainly not a definition that's being used for antitrust purposes. So there's been debate among, from everybody from practitioners to the FTC commissioners to DOJ officials about what consumer welfare means, and courts have been also all over the place with it. So this is an area that could definitely benefit from some clarity.
Okay. How do other jurisdictions interpret consumer welfare in Europe or other areas around the world?
Well, consumer welfare and the focus on consumer welfare has been uniquely focused in the U.S. There's been a lot of debate focused in the U.S. on what consumer welfare means. And it's interesting that this debate has arisen primarily in the U.S. rather than in other jurisdictions that have antitrust laws. I think that's because in other jurisdictions, particularly new or emerging jurisdictions with antitrust laws, the purpose of the antitrust laws may be something broader than the consumer welfare focus that we have here in the U.S. So when you're dealing with a new economy, they're trying to get things off the ground. They're trying to level the playing field. They're trying to make sure that businesses are competing fairly. They're trying to make sure that there's a remedy for anti-competitive behavior. There's many other things going on in those jurisdictions. In the U.S., we have the benefit of an established rule of law. And so some of these other concerns that affect antitrust laws and competition laws in other jurisdictions aren't present here. And so we can really focus on this consumer welfare aspect and focus for the antitrust laws here.
But competition affects more than just consumers. It also affects suppliers. How does consumer welfare address concerns that go up the supply chain?
Well, so it depends on what definition of consumer welfare you're using. So some people advocate that consumer welfare really means just the ultimate consumers for the products that are at issue. I think in the U.S., a more appropriate definition would be a total welfare standard, taking these kind of considerations into account, but it's unclear that that's where the courts and where the agencies are going right now.
Okay, but presumably if merging entities are able to get lower prices from their suppliers, often referred to as economies of scale, and pass those lower prices on to their customers, that's seen as generally improving consumer welfare. Isn't that generally accepted here?
That would be true if you use a total welfare standard, which I think is the appropriate standard. You should definitely take those into account. But there are certainly people out there, particularly in the antitrust arena, who think that that's not the appropriate standard and that those are considered external considerations that may not feature as prominently in a more consumer-focused consumer welfare standard.
I mean, and then let's look beyond the supply chain. Just in general, consolidation is businesses getting bigger. We were on the heels here of too big to fail. What role should antitrust play when bigness leads to instability in the economic system?
Well, that's an easy question. Antitrust should not play a role at all in determining whether a company is too big. That's a regulatory concern. It's not really an antitrust concern. This is not an antitrust regime where we punish people for being successful and for growing their businesses. In fact, it's just the opposite. We want to encourage businesses to succeed and hope that the free market will take care of the rest.
That's true, but mergers aren't growing businesses organically. It's two big companies coming together to form a larger entity. Mm-hmm. Is that necessarily good competition?
Well, there's an important distinction here between growing through a merger and growing organically. My prior answer, I was focused on growing organically. But if you're looking at growing through a merger context, then whether the company becomes big in a nominal sense or in some kind of revenue measure shouldn't really matter in terms of the antitrust analysis. The antitrust analysis should focus on how that company is competing in the industry, what other competitors are available, and how does that merger affect the market overall. It shouldn't have anything to do with the ultimate size of the merged company.
Okay, so the antitrust agencies are really the only agencies out there that have the authority to block combinations. Shouldn't they be empowered to take on a broader array of challenges than just mergers that affect consumer welfare?
Well, under the statutes that they currently have in place, no. Their mission under the current statutory regime is to protect consumers and to protect competition. It's not to regulate an industry. And I would just challenge your assumption in the question that the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice are the only agencies that can do this. There are other regulatory agencies out there that can address issues that are not antitrust related, such as growing too big. So, for example, the banking industry is subject to numerous regulators that if for non-antitrust reasons, for financial stability reasons, or for other reasons, the banking regulators thought that a bank was getting too big, they can step in under their statutes, or we could create authority under their statutes that would give them the ability to regulate the size of banks. But that's really not the role of an antitrust authority.
But the statute says competition. And competition essentially is somebody who does the same thing you do to serve the same base that you serve at its very barest definition of what a competitor is. And when at any time two companies come together, that's one less competitor that's out there. That is a lessening of competition, mm-hmm. and that is the mandate of antitrust law.
Mm-hmm. It is, but when you're looking at that from a merger perspective, and under Clayton 7 and the other antitrust laws, you're assessing how that merged company is going to compete in a market, in a relevant market after that merger, and what effect that merger is going to have on the relevant market. Now, it may be that the merger has created a company that is big that will negatively affect that competition. And in those scenarios, you're analyzing the effect on competition, not the fact that the company got bigger.
Sure.
And I think that's an important distinction.
And that is absolutely how the law functions today. With these new emerging markets that are trying to explore other things outside of what the U.S. considers, is there any concern that through harmonization the U.S. might depart from the way it approaches antitrust to conform with other jurisdictions?
I think that harmonization is an important topic as the world gets more flat, to use Thomas Friedman's language. But I think that the U.S. has a strong history of antitrust enforcement and has a strong grounding in economics. And so it would take a pretty radical shift in U.S. policy for antitrust to kind of move the FTC and the Department of Justice's antitrust analysis outside of the current box and into kind of what we would consider non-antitrust and non-competition considerations.
If it were to happen, where would we see it come from? Would it be a judicial court decision? Would it be from legislation? Or would it be from a new school of antitrust compared to, say, the Chicago school or other terms thrown around of similar sort?
I almost think it would take an act of Congress to force the agencies to shift away from their consumer protection missions.
Right. Amanda, you've been involved in some retail work. I know you worked in the FTC on the Whole Foods FTC case.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to learn a little bit about where we are right now with antitrust in retail. What are the kind of the key issues that you think are most important when evaluating retail mergers?
Sure. So market definition is probably first and foremost the most important issue when you're thinking about a retail merger. Despite the 2010 changes to the merger guidelines, market definition is still very important. And depending on the retail industry that you're talking about, most physical retail markets are going to be local. They're going to be fairly localized or regional markets as opposed to broader U.S., North America, or worldwide markets. And that makes sense because you have to think about where people physically buy stuff. You can only travel with a gallon of milk in your trunk for so long. So you're necessarily going to be shopping at a grocery store that's reasonably close to either where you work or where you live. And so market definition is always a key first issue to think about. And it's highly dependent on facts on the ground, especially for physical products that you're acquiring in stores. So you want to look at things like, what are the products being acquired here? How durable are they? So for example, if you buy a carton of ice cream in the summer, you're not going to travel 50 miles unless you've got a cooler in your trunk. Most people don't. You've got to look at, what are the reasonable travel paths that people are going to take to get to these locations? What are the traffic patterns? Are there loyalty programs or other things like that that come into play? So all of these factors can affect the market definition analysis.
And that seems to deal a lot with the geographic market definition. Mm-hmm. But what about the product market definition?
Product market definition is very interesting, and there's been some recent focus, particularly within the FTC that handles most of the retail side mergers, looking at actual consumer spending patterns and looking at consumer behavior. So we've seen just in some recent non-public cases that I've worked on, the agencies have been looking for information about consumer surveys, asking for a lot of information about consumer survey data. And those surveys often go into potential competitive alternatives for customers. So that's been an emerging issue that we're seeing more of lately. We also see the agencies really focusing on the brown shoe reasonable interchangeability test and thinking about what are functional substitutes for consumers and how do consumers actually use the products. So there's been, certainly a lot of focus on that in determining product market issues.
But the product market discussion isn't solely based on the products. It's also based on the retail establishment themselves. For example, in 1997, the Staples FTC case, we saw that office superstores was a market definition, and that excluded other retailers that sold the same products. Why is this an important distinction?
Yeah, it's similarly in the FTC's case against Whole Foods and Wild Oats. You can buy a gallon of milk at Whole Foods, you can buy a gallon of milk at any conventional supermarket, but for some reason in that case, the market definition was limited to premium, natural, and organic supermarkets as opposed to broader supermarkets. Now, same in Staples Office Depot. In the case brought back in a dozen years ago or so. This is kind of going back to the point that I made earlier about consumer buying behavior and how that's important in an agency investigation into these types of mergers. The agencies really are focusing on what are practical substitutes for consumers, not just technical functional substitutes. So, in Staples Office Depot, you can buy a pencil anywhere. You can buy a pencil probably at a gas station. You can buy a pencil at, Staples. You can buy a pencil at Walmart. You can buy the same exact pencil a lot of different places. But what they found in that case, and what the FTC also found in Whole Foods, is that there are certain types of customers that gravitate towards these certain types of retailers, and that can definitely be a factor in the market analysis.
Okay, and now what have we seen as a result? I think in December of 2012, the FTC conducted a study about retailer mergers. What was found out of that study?
Yeah, that was a really interesting merger retrospective. It was part of the FTC's broader merger retrospective project. This is one of the few that the FTC has done specifically relating to retail. This one looked back at supermarket deals that had been cleared, supermarket deals that had been challenged over several years. This was a Bureau of Economics working paper study. done by Dan Hoskin and others. And in that paper, they were looking at whether a structural presumption actually proved helpful in retail type cases. And in the retrospective, they found that looking back, deals that they had cleared in markets with high concentration ratios actually did seem to suggest that there were higher prices resulting from those deals. And interestingly, deals where the markets were defined as either moderately concentrated or unconcentrated actually resulted in lower prices for consumers. So that tends to add some support to the use of structural presumptions in retail mergers.
Now, based on these market definition issues we were talking about, it seems that the purchasing experience plays a role in assessing the product market in retail mergers. With this in mind, what role does online purchasing play when we look at retail mergers?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I'm not sure that there's been a lot of testing of that question so far. We haven't seen a lot of activity in the merger arena that have gotten full assessments by the agencies considering these questions. So internet retailing is really kind of the new horizon. There are, as a counselor for a party, if I were going into the FTC on any merger that could remotely involve a competing product coming out of an internet company, I would certainly try to argue that that's in the market. But I just don't know whether those arguments have been successful. I think those arguments are also going to be highly dependent on what products you're talking about here. So for example, if you're assessing competition in books, the argument that Amazon.com and other online retailers for books are strong competitors in that market are going to be much stronger than for products that are maybe less durable, groceries or other types of products that don't have such an online presence these days.
It would seem to me that with the Staples Office Depot merger, if Office Superstores excludes Kmart's, Walmart's, wouldn't it even further exclude the Amazons and the online purchasing entities that are out there?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I think with the recently announced Office Depot, Office Max merger, we'll get some hopefully helpful information on how the agencies would think about that. But unfortunately, that deal's still pending. So, I think it will be informative to see how the agencies assess that exact issue, now several years later after the Staples Office Depot deal was challenged.
I think it's great that you bring up the Office Depot Office Max merger. Now, is there anything that we can draw from the 2012 retrospective in the supermarkets that can help us inform as to what might be concerning the agencies this time around?
Well, I think that in the retrospective, particularly, it related to supermarkets. It was very specifically narrowed to supermarkets. But I think one thing that we can take away from that is that the structural presumptions and the structural analysis that the agencies do is not gone. Even though the 2010 merger guidelines have kind of suggested that market definition may not play as an important role in their analysis, they still look at that and it still matters. It's still part of the story that they have to tell. And so when merger retrospectives like the one that came out in December are announced and they show support for these structural presumptions, it just reemphasizes that you do have to go back and you have to do your market definition exercise and you have to figure out how to define that. But when you have a 4-3 or a 3-2, that's going to be an important factor.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Amanda. We really enjoyed having you today.
Okay, it was my pleasure.